It's 2:17 a.m. in the operations room. The lights are dim. Screens glow blue against tired faces. Somewhere, thousands of miles away, a radar signature flickers. A convoy moves. A signal is intercepted. And in that quiet, compressed moment, someone makes a decision that could redraw the map of the Middle East. Now imagine you're sitting in that chair, not as a soldier pulling a trigger, not as a pilot locking onto a target, but as the person who has to decide whether the strike happens at all. We like to imagine war as explosions and speeches, jets screaming across the sky, flags waving, clear villains, clear heroes. But the psychological reality is much quieter. It's a room full of humans with racing hearts, incomplete information, and the unbearable weight of what if we're wrong? When we talk about Operation Epic Fury, the coordinated US-Israel strikes on Iranian-linked targets, most people ask political questions. Who provoked whom? Was it justified? What happens next? But underneath the geopolitics lies something more raw and more universal. What happens inside the human mind when nations feel cornered? Because nations don't have emotions, people do. Imagine a series of escalating events, missile exchanges through proxies, intelligence reports warning of imminent threats, leaders briefed on worst-case scenarios. Each report doesn't just add information, it adds pressure. Pressure changes perception, and perception changes behavior. In military psychology, there's something called threat amplification. When a rival demonstrates capability and intent, your brain doesn't process it calmly. The amygdala, that ancient alarm system deep in your skull, lights up. It doesn't care about diplomacy, it cares about survival. On a battlefield, that response keeps you alive. In geopolitics, it can accelerate escalation. Think back to the tension of the Cold War, especially during the Cuban Missile Crisis. One radar misread, one submarine commander under stress, one misinterpreted signal. Humanity stood on the edge because the human brain, under threat, narrows its focus. It sees danger first. It prepares to strike before being struck. Now place yourself in the strategic mindset leading up to Operation Epic Fury. Intelligence suggests increasing coordination between Iranian-backed groups. Rocket fire tests defenses. Regional allies feel exposed. Political leaders feel watched, not just by enemies, but by their own populations. And that's where another layer of psychology enters: audience pressure. Leaders don't just calculate military outcomes, they calculate perception. If they appear weak, deterrence erodes. If they overreact, escalation spirals. So they walk a tightrope over a canyon filled with consequences. You might think bravery in this context means bold action, but psychologically, boldness often masks fear. Not personal fear, but collective fear. Fear of losing credibility, fear of appearing indecisive, fear of inviting further aggression. The strikes themselves, precise, calculated, coordinated, are not acts of impulse, they are acts of conditioned response. Years of doctrine, training, and deterrence theory shaping a reflex. In military institutions, obedience to chain of command is drilled deep, not because soldiers lack independent thought, but because hesitation in combat can be fatal. And here's something uncomfortable: obedience feels safer than ambiguity. Stanley Milgram's obedience experiments in the 1960s showed how ordinary people comply with authority under pressure. In war, that compliance isn't a flaw, it's a feature. It creates cohesion, it ensures coordinated action. But it also means that when leadership decides to escalate, thousands of individuals align almost instantly. Would you hesitate if your commanding officer said the threat was imminent, or would you trust the system? Trust is the invisible backbone of military action. Unit cohesion, that deep brotherhood forged in shared hardship, transforms fear into focus. Soldiers don't fight primarily for abstract policy, they fight for the person next to them.
The same dynamic scales upward. Nations often act not only for strategic objectives, but to reassure allies, "We stand with you." Operation Epic Fury, in psychological terms, wasn't just about destroying targets, it was about sending a message, and messages in war are psychological weapons.
Deterrence operates on belief. If your adversary believes you will respond forcefully, they may hesitate. But belief requires demonstration, and demonstration carries risk. So decision-makers sit in that dimly lit room, weighing probabilities against human cost. Now let's zoom in further. Imagine a pilot preparing for a strike, heart rate elevated, hands steady because they've trained thousands of hours for this exact scenario. The brain, under acute stress, releases adrenaline and cortisol. Vision sharpens, peripheral noise fades. This is fight or flight refined into focus. But here's the paradox. The same biology that sharpens performance in the moment can haunt a person afterward. Combat stress doesn't vanish when the mission ends. The brain remembers intensity. It encodes threat deeply. That's why even remote warfare, drone operations, long-distance strikes, carries psychological weight. Distance does not eliminate responsibility. And then there's moral injury. Moral injury occurs when someone feels they violated their core ethical beliefs, even if they followed orders. It's not the same as fear-based trauma. It's quieter. It whispers at night. In conflicts involving complex regional politics and civilian risk, this burden can be heavy. So when we talk about what triggered the attacks, we shouldn't just analyze missiles and maps. We should analyze perception loops. One side interprets defense as aggression. The other interprets preemption as survival. Each action reinforces the other's fear narrative. Psychologists call this the security dilemma. When one actor increases security, others feel less secure, and so they respond. It's not irrational, it's tragically human. You might be wondering, could restraint have worked? Possibly, but restraint requires extraordinary psychological discipline, the ability to tolerate uncertainty without reacting. And uncertainty is one of the most uncomfortable states for the human brain. Your brain prefers a bad certainty over a prolonged maybe.
So if intelligence suggested an imminent threat, even a small probability might feel intolerable. Leaders imagine headlines, casualty counts, historical judgment, and in that mental simulation, the cost of inaction may feel heavier than the cost of action. History is full of these moments. Before the Six-Day War in 1967, preemptive calculations shaped outcomes dramatically. During World War I, mobilizations intended as deterrence were interpreted as aggression. Once the machinery of war starts moving, stopping it requires immense psychological resistance. Operation Epic Fury sits within that lineage, not identical, but psychologically similar. Escalation born from perceived necessity. But here's where I want you to pause. It's easy to reduce this to strategy games played by powerful figures, but behind every strategic choice are human nervous systems. Humans with families, humans with biases, humans shaped by past conflicts and institutional memory. And the mind under threat becomes predictive. It scans for patterns. If previous attacks went unanswered and emboldened adversaries, the brain encodes that as a lesson. Next time, respond faster, stronger. This is how cycles form. So what separates a leader who escalates from one who de-escalates? Often, it's psychological tolerance for ambiguity, the ability to endure criticism at home while holding fire, the ability to absorb short-term reputational damage for long-term stability. That kind of restraint looks weak in the moment, but psychologically, it may require more courage than pulling the trigger. Courage in war isn't the absence of fear, it's action despite fear. And sometimes that action is restraint. Sometimes it's decisive force. The tragedy is that both sides often believe they are acting defensively. Now think about your own mind, not in a war zone, but in conflict. When someone criticizes you, do you strike back immediately, or can you sit with the discomfort? On a personal scale, escalation feels satisfying. It releases tension. On a geopolitical scale, it can reshape history. The human brain hasn't evolved as fast as our weapons have. Our stress responses are ancient. Our technology is modern. That gap creates danger. Operation Epic Fury, in the end, wasn't triggered by a single event. It was triggered by accumulated perception, by rising threat signals, by institutional memory, by political pressure, by the deeply human desire to control uncertainty. And that's what makes it both understandable and unsettling. Because if war begins in the mind, in interpretation, fear, anticipation, then preventing it also begins there. So the next time you see headlines about strikes and retaliation, remember the quiet rooms, the racing hearts, the split-second decisions shaped by years of doctrine and centuries of conflict psychology. Ask yourself, if you were in that chair at 2:17 a.m. with incomplete information and immense responsibility, what would your brain do? Would fear narrow your vision? Would loyalty guide you? Would you risk restraint? There are no easy answers, only human ones. And maybe that's the most important insight of all. War is not driven by monsters, it's driven by minds, stressed, calculating minds, trying to prevent catastrophe, sometimes by risking it. If this exploration made you think differently about strength, fear, or decision-making under pressure, I'd love to hear your perspective. Drop your thoughts below. Do you believe escalation was inevitable, or do you think psychological restraint could have changed the course? Because understanding the battlefield of the mind might be the first step towards reshaping the battlefield of the world.